Before she wore the scarlet letter, Hester Prynne was already a rebel. In this untold prequel to Nathaniel Hawthorne's classic, discover the powerful moment that forged her unbreakable spirit. If you love timeless characters, dramatic storytelling, and hidden backstories, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story that brings classic literature to life. Let's start the story. In the year of our Lord 1623, the moorland winds swept low across the fields of Devonshire, rustling the sparse heather with a sound like whispered secrets. In a cottage hemmed by blackthorn and lichen-covered stone, a girl sat by the hearth, her dark hair unbound and a crimson thread wound around her small fingers, an idle occupation of the hands to quiet the unrest of the heart. Hester Prynne, then of tender years and not yet acquainted with the weight of shame nor the heaviness of an unyielding gaze, waited. She had waited since the sun first peeled back the curtain of mist from the hills, and now, as twilight laid its gray veil upon the land, she still waited. "Mother," she said at last, her voice breaking the long silence like a dropped teacup. "He should have returned by now." Margaret Prynne did not look up from her worn Bible, whose pages fluttered in the draught like the feathers of some dying bird. "He was summoned by men of the law, Hester," she answered curtly. "They do not speak on our time, but on God's." "But God is not cruel," said Hester, though her voice faltered beneath the stern arch of her mother's brow. "You know not what you speak," came the reply, sharp as flint. "Go to your stitching." Hester turned her eyes to the door, where the wind rattled the latch with ghostly insistence. Her father, Elias Prynne, tailor, thinker, and man given to solitary reflections beneath the stars, had been taken 3 days prior to answer charges laid not in the courts of man but in the invisible tribunal of whispered heresies. He had spoken too freely in the marketplace of Scripture unendorsed, of mercy too wide and judgment too narrow. These were dangerous virtues, not to be trafficked by those of plain means. "I do not believe he is lost," she said quietly, to the flickering shadows. "He would not forsake us." Margaret's voice came cold as cellar stone. "Do not cling to hope, child. It is a rope that breaks when most needed." Hester looked again to the fire, where the logs hissed and cracked with secret fury. Her fingers tightened around the crimson thread, which she had pulled from a scrap of her father's sewing. An unfinished robe, made fine with care but never worn. She had hidden the thread in the pocket of her gown, as if it bore some charm against the encroaching silence of his absence. That night, she crept from her pallet and into her father's workroom, which still smelled of beeswax, dye, and the subtle spice of pipe tobacco. The moon, pale and thin, filtered through the narrow panes, casting a silvery veil upon the disorder of his last day's labors. Hester moved slowly, reverently, her hand brushing the fabric as though it were holy relic. Upon the table, beneath a spool and the scattered tools of his craft, she found it. A torn corner from a leather-bound journal, smudged with ink and the sweat of a restless hand. The words, written in her father's familiar hand, read only, "What is truth, if not worn on the soul?" She clutched the scrap to her chest and closed her eyes, and in that moment, a resolve, too large, too solemn for her age, rose like a tide within her. Though she could not name it, nor trace its outline with words, something in her heart ceased its wavering. The night did not answer her vigil. Elias Prynne was never seen again. Yet in the silence he left behind, something began to take shape in the girl, something neither law nor sermon would ever fully contain. Spring came reluctantly to Devonshire that year, as if the earth itself hesitated to awaken, unwilling to greet the loss that winter had buried beneath its frost. The thaw did little to lift the silence that now dwelt in the Prynne household, where warmth had once been measured not by the fire but by the quiet hum of Elias's voice at his needlework and the gentle cadence of Scripture spoken without wrath. Margaret Prynne, widow in all but name, sat daily by the cold hearth, her spine rigid, her fingers moving ceaselessly through the pages of her Bible, worn soft as linen. The passage most oft upon her tongue was from Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season." Though her voice, dry and sharp, rendered the sacred words brittle as old wood. "Hester," now in her 13th year, moved like a shadow about the house. Her once vibrant gaze had dulled, not from lack of fire but from a growing habit of quietness, a watchful turning inward. She had asked after her father only once more, upon the morning of the May Day bell. "Mother," she had said, eyes fixed not on Margaret's face but on the pale drift of clouds beyond the window, "do you believe he yet lives?" To this Margaret gave no answer. She merely struck the tinder for the fire, and when it failed to catch, struck it again, fiercely until the flint snapped. One evening, a fortnight after Easter, the house was awakened by the distant tolling of the town watch bell and the murmur of unrest in the lanes beyond. Hester, roused from uneasy sleep, pressed her face to the window and beheld a curious glow, ruddy and uncertain, rising from the direction of the common lane. "The tailor's shed is afire," a voice called in the night. By the time Hester and her mother reached the scene, little remained of Elias Prynne's workshop but blackened beams and smoldering ash. The onlookers, thin-lipped women with bonnets drawn low and men whose eyes bore the stiffness of the pious, offered no comfort. One man muttered, not low enough to be missed, "The Lord purges his house." Margaret stood as still as stone, the fire reflected in her eyes, yet no tears marked her face. Hester, trembling, stepped forward, drawn toward the charred remains as if they held the very shape of her father's voice. She stooped near what had been the cutting table. Beneath the soot-stained floorboards, some small glint caught her eye. Digging with her bare hands, she uncovered a half-melted thimble, her father's. She pressed it into her palm and turned, only to find her mother watching her with eyes hard as frost. "You will not keep that," said Margaret. "But it is his," Hester whispered. "No," the mother answered. "It is of him, and he is gone. Do not court ghosts." That night, Margaret removed the books Elias had left behind, the ones with Greek letters and Latin phrases, and fed them to the fire. Hester, seated in the shadows, watched in stunned silence as sacred knowledge curled into smoke. "Why must they burn?" she asked. "Because they were not written in the fear of God," Margaret said. "And what is not written in fear is written in pride, and pride is the devil's ink." The next morning, Hester found her reading book, one her father had given her, filled with illuminated letters and notes in his hand, was gone. In its place lay a small leather-bound primer of Psalms, dry and joyless. She traced the plain letters of the new book and said nothing. But that night, as the candle guttered low and Margaret slept, Hester returned to the ruins of the workshop. There, among the debris, she found one unspoiled remnant. A scrap of linen, singed at the edges, with a single crimson thread sewn in a sweeping curve, an unfinished collar, left incomplete by fire or fate. Clutching it to her chest, she whispered aloud to the night, "You are not ashes, you are a spark." It was then, in that quiet ruin, that Hester made her first vow, not to obedience, nor to rebellion, but to remembrance. It was the season of Michaelmas, when the sun lingered a little longer on the withering fields and the air bore that peculiar stillness, as though the world held its breath before the falling of leaves. In the village of Lidford, where Hester and her mother had removed following the ruin of their former home, the small parish whispered anew, not of her father's vanishing nor the fire that followed it, but of Hester herself, now grown into a young maid of unusual bearing and solemn eye. "She speaks with strange gravity for one so tender," murmured Mistress Elwood, who sold flax and feared the wit of children more than she feared the devil. "She sews with uncommon skill," added another, "but there is pride in her thread." Such was the quiet consensus, that Hester Prynne bore within her some seed of difference, not yet sin, but something perilously close to it. It was in this time that Master Roger Prynne, though he had not yet taken that name, came to call. A scholar and apothecary of advancing years, he had returned from the continent after studies in Padua and Leyden. Thin of frame and stooped somewhat from study, his eyes burned with a patient fire, like embers concealed beneath ash. He came, at first, under the pretense of treating Margaret's lingering fevers. But soon, his gaze turned toward the daughter with increasing frequency, though never with the warm admiration of youth. It was rather a kind of curiosity, a clinical interest, as one might devote to some peculiar stone, unearthed and not yet classified. One afternoon, as Hester bent over her needlework, the physician entered unannounced. "You have a gift, Mistress Prynne," he said, watching the needle flash like lightning across the linen. She looked up, her voice calm, guarded. "It is not a gift, sir, but a labor. Labor well suited to women," he mused. "And yet, you do not hold it with a woman's docility." Hester did not reply, but her fingers moved faster, as if to finish the seam before patience wore out. "I have seen many minds in my day," he continued, settling into the chair near the hearth. "Men mostly, minds that grasp after truth like Jacob at the angel's heel. But yours is silent, like a pool not yet stirred. I wonder what reflection lies beneath it." She met his gaze then. "It is not always safe to peer too deep, Master Chillingworth." A smile crept upon his lips, though it lacked mirth. "Then perhaps I am unwise to try." That evening, Margaret took her daughter aside. The firelight touched the weary folds of her face, and for a moment, she seemed not stern, but spent. "You are near to womanhood," she said, "and women must be kept. Master Chillingworth is of good standing, learned, temperate, and willing. He asks nothing of you but companionship and quiet honor. That is more than most girls receive." Hester stared into the fire. "Does he ask for love?" "Love is the invention of idle daughters," Margaret snapped. "What he offers is steadiness and protection. In this world, those are rarer than love and worth more in the end." Later, alone in the small chamber that was hers, Hester sat with her knees drawn to her chest. The unfinished collar, her father's last work, lay folded in her lap, its crimson thread dulled in the dusk. "Steadiness," she murmured to the air. "Protection." In the window's reflection, her face looked older than its years, as though the shadow of some future sorrow already brushed her brow. She pressed the scrap of linen to her heart and whispered into the darkness. "I will not be kept, not like a bird in a cage, nor a secret behind lips. If I must bind myself, let it be by thread of my own choosing." But the veil of duty had been drawn, and whether to lift it or wear it would soon become her burden. The banns were read aloud in the chapel of St. Petrox, and with each recitation, Hester's silence grew heavier, like the fall of snow on a laden bough. Roger Chillingworth, who, though not yet aged beyond vigor, was older by near 20 winters, took her arm with the manner of a man acquiring a rare volume, one he meant to study in private and at leisure. The village matrons offered their approving murmurs, seeing in the match not romance, but right order. For what was a clever girl without station to do but wed a man of learning and means, even if his touch chilled her like a draught beneath the door? "Better a wise husband than a handsome fool," they said. "She may warm to him in time." Hester, however, warmed to nothing. Her gaze, when it rested upon her betrothed, remained clear and inscrutable, like water that reflects only the sky. But in her private hours, she took up her needle not for wedding cloth, but for something else entirely. By candlelight, when Margaret had retired and Chillingworth was abroad with his books or tinctures, Hester drew from beneath the floorboard a linen shift, plain at first until she began to work her embroidery into it with a strange fervor. The needle flashed and dipped with the same quiet intensity that marked her gaze. Her fingers, though slender, seemed driven by a force beyond propriety. And upon the breast of the shift, where no soul but the wearer would see, she stitched a letter. Not a word, but a symbol wrought in deep crimson, encircled with thorn and vine. It was no letter of the alphabet, though it resembled one. No mark of name, though it burned with identity. It was hers, and hers alone. One morning, Margaret discovered the garment hidden amongst the firewood, waiting to be retrieved. She held it up to the light, and upon seeing the blood-red embroidery, her face went pale. "Explain this blasphemy," she demanded. Hester stood her ground. "It is not blasphemy, but truth." "It is pride," Margaret hissed. "You tempt God with these symbols. You tempt shame with your own hand." "I tempt nothing," said Hester, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I speak in thread, what I am not allowed to say in words." "You are a woman," her mother cried. "You will be a wife, and your thread should serve your husband, not your vanity." To this Hester said nothing, but her fingers, hidden behind her back, clutched the edge of her apron where a length of that same crimson thread was sewn into the hem, hidden but never absent. Later that day, Chillingworth found her walking alone on the moor. The sky had clouded, and the wind lifted her unbound hair like a banner. "You are always in thought," he said, approaching with his measured step. "It would please me to know those thoughts, should you ever wish to share them." Hester turned, and her smile, if it could be called that, was as faint and far away as a star seen at dawn. "My thoughts, good sir, are mostly made of wind and thread. They pass quickly, and leave little behind." "You are not easy to know," he said, narrowing his gaze. "But perhaps that is the charm." "Perhaps," she said, and walked on. But as she moved past him, the wind caught the edge of her sleeve and lifted it, revealing the crimson thread woven through the cuff like a silent cry. He saw it, and though he said nothing then, his eyes followed her with a strange intensity, curious, cold, and faintly possessive. Thus did Hester's quiet defiance begin, not in speech nor in flight, but in the crimson defilement of the role others had chosen for her, a rebellion of silk and silence. Winter, that grim Puritan, descended upon Lidford with a severity not seen in many years. The trees stood gaunt and unadorned, the river hardened its surface to all passage, and the wind that wound through the crooked lanes bore the cruel edge of judgment. Within the Prynne household, the fire burned dutifully, though it cast more shadow than warmth. Margaret had grown sick again, and though her body ailed, it was her spirit that spoke most often, sour and sanctimonious beneath the weight of her illness. "You will wed him at Candlemas?" she said one evening, her voice ragged with phlegm. "A good match will cure what loss and hunger have made in you." Hester sat by the window, her sewing idle in her lap. She watched the snow sift down like quiet absolution upon a world unwilling to forgive. "Will it cure what is not visible?" she asked. "Do not mock me, girl," said Margaret. "Marriage is not for poetry. It is a wall to lean on when youth deserts you." "There are walls that smother," Hester murmured. Margaret gave a bitter cough. "You speak as though you had a choice." That night, Hester stood before the small looking-glass nailed crookedly to the wall above the basin. Her reflection seemed half-ghost, pale, half-formed, yet with eyes dark as river stones. She traced the mirror's edge with her finger and whispered, as though speaking to some other self that hovered just beyond the glass. "If I say no, what remains?" The glass, of course, gave no answer. 2 days hence, Roger Chillingworth came to call. His manner was precise, as ever, and his words cloaked in civility, but beneath them lurked a hunger more intellectual than affectionate. He brought with him a book of Dutch herbal cures and a small locket of brass, which he presented to Hester as a token. "I have placed within it a pressed flower," he said, "from the east. It is said to bring clarity." She opened it. The flower, colorless and brittle, crumbled at her touch. "I thank you," she said, closing it gently. "But I do not need clarity. Only courage." Chillingworth tilted his head, examining her as one might a riddle etched in bone. "And is it courage or pride that keeps your soul so heavily guarded?" She met his gaze. "I do not know. Does it matter if it holds?" To this he did not answer, but after a moment, he said with cold deliberation, "There are women whose fire dims after marriage, others who burn brighter, though not always safely." "Then I shall be my own wick and my own flame," she replied. He offered a thin smile. "You are an unusual girl, Mistress Prynne." "That I have learned," she said, rising. "But I was not made to be usual." That night, she returned to the woodshed, where the scent of old ash still lingered. There, beneath a hollow log, she had hidden a bundle wrapped in oilskin. The unfinished linen shift, the thimble, and her father's torn page, now creased and softened by her touch. These were relics, not of grief, but of resistance. She knelt and lit a small taper, shielding it from the wind. The flame danced like a captive soul, and its glow cast a halo around her pale face. "If I am to make a bargain," she said aloud, "let it be with the truth." Then she pressed her fingers to the linen, whispering the words her father had left. What is truth, if not worn on the soul? And there, in the hush of winter, she made her second vow, not to be married, not to be meek, not to be spared, but to endure with her whole self intact. Though she would wear the veil, she would never let it blind her. It was upon a morning heavy with sea mist that the ship came into port, its black hull streaked with salt, sails patched and weather-worn, and its deck alive with strange voices speaking Dutch, French, and other tongues that slipped like water through the English air. The folk of Lidford, unused to visitors but twice in a year, gathered along the quay with the same solemn interest they reserved for funerals or executions. The ship, De Vrede, had made anchor due to some injury to her rigging, and word spread that she would remain only 3 days. Hester stood apart from the cluster of townspeople, the wind tugging at her cloak, her cheeks tinged with cold. She stared not at the ship but at the men who came ashore, rough-handed sailors and pale scholars in long coats, merchants bearing narrow cases, and one man in particular whose manner did not match the rest. He was young, not many years beyond Hester herself, though dressed in finer cloth than most and bearing a small satchel at his hip. His hair was dark, and his countenance, though not handsome in the way of idle poetry, had a stillness to it, a kind of inward grace. He spoke little, but his eyes moved over the village with interest, pausing when they reached her. Their eyes met, only a moment, but the world tilted, almost imperceptibly. Later, she found herself at the apothecary's, sent on some errand by her mother. She stepped inside to find Roger Chillingworth at his work, grinding powder from a root she did not know. The shop smelled of dried herbs and old pages. At the counter, the young stranger stood, speaking low and respectfully in Latin. Chillingworth glanced at her, then back to his guest. "This is Mistress Hester Prynne," he said, as though presenting a thesis. "Soon to be my wife." The young man turned, bowed with the grace of an educated traveler, and said in measured English, "I am Willem van Holt. I study under Master Grotius, and have journeyed here by necessity, though your land has its own interest." Hester inclined her head. "What interest might a scholar find in Lidford, sir?" He smiled gently. "The same interest one finds in silence. It conceals more than it reveals." At this, Chillingworth's lips twitched. "Be warned, Master Van Holt. Silence in women is often mistaken for virtue." "And yet," said Willem, "I have found that silence speaks more surely than any sermon." There was no more time for speech. Hester collected her tinctures and left, yet something stirred within her, some spark she dared not name. That night, she returned to her chamber and took out the unfinished shift. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, for the silence that Willem had named seemed now to press at her chest. "What is this foolish stirring?" she asked herself, though she knew it was no foolishness. It was hunger, not of the flesh, but of spirit. A hunger for understanding, for being seen without instruction or judgment. He bowed to me as an equal, she thought. He did not ask me to smile. The next day, she passed the harbor again, and found him there, sketching the outline of the cliffs in a leather-bound book. He saw her and raised a hand in greeting, though he did not approach. She stood there only a moment before turning back toward home. As she walked, her thoughts surged against the bounds of her duty like waves battering a locked hull. At supper, Chillingworth spoke of the foreigner. "A quiet man," he said. "Learned, certainly, but I wonder what he seeks here." Hester did not lift her eyes. "Perhaps he seeks the same as we all do, a place to rest." Chillingworth regarded her with a long, thin look. "Let us hope," he said, "that he finds no reason to linger." By candlelight, Hester wrote her third vow in the margins of her father's torn manuscript. "I will remember the face of him who did not fear my silence." The ship would sail soon and the man with it, but something in Hester had shifted. like a sail loosed and struck by sudden wind. The snow melted from the rooftops, and the sharp clarity of late winter gave way to the first damp hints of thaw. The village of Lidford emerged slowly from its frostbitten silence, though within Hester's breast there grew a tumult that no season could quiet. The Dutch ship, De Vrede, remained longer than expected, her mast damaged beyond quick repair. And with it, Master Willem van Holt remained, taking lodging with the Reverend Clark, whose library drew him as surely as any pulpit had ever drawn a penitent. For reasons she dared not confess, not even to herself, Hester found her steps drawn more often to the lanes where the scholar might pass. These were not contrived meetings, but neither were they wholly chance. A nod, a word exchanged, a moment's pause by the blackthorn hedge, each encounter brief, each one kindling a warmth she kept buried deep. One morning, while returning from the seamstress's house with a length of muslin for her wedding shift, a garment that felt more like a shroud than a bridal cloth, Hester rounded the bend near the green and found Willem standing alone beneath the bare-limbed hawthorn tree. His book was shut, his gaze turned toward the hills. She hesitated. "I did not expect to meet you here," she said softly. "Nor I you," he replied. "But I am pleased by the fortune." He gestured to the sky, where a lone kestrel circled. "They say these birds mate only once," he mused. "And if one dies, the other lives on in solitude. Strange, is it not, that fidelity should be both beautiful and sorrowful?" Hester's voice caught. "Most virtues are. They come to us not in joy, but as burdens we are taught to carry." He turned to her, his dark eyes alight with a gentleness that seemed to reach beyond words. "Is that how you see your coming marriage?" She looked down at the muslin in her hands, now damp from melting snow. "I see it as a path," she said. "Not of my own choosing, but one which, if I turn from it, leads to exile. And if you follow it, then I wear the veil and bear the silence," she whispered. A silence followed, not empty but heavy, as though time itself had paused to listen. Willem broke it gently. "I have known women who lived by the dictates of others. They were admired, even praised. But I do not remember them. The ones I recall are those who dared to speak, even when the world turned its face from them." She felt the sting of tears rise, not from sorrow, but from recognition. She had not wept in many months. "You speak as though courage is a virtue a woman may claim," she said. He stepped closer, his voice low. "It is the only virtue worth claiming." Just then, the bell from St. Petrock's sounded noon. Startled, Hester took a step back, clutching the muslin to her chest. "I must go," she said. "If they see." "I will not keep you," Willem said. "Only know this. There is a fire in you that should not be buried beneath ash." She fled then, not from him, but from the truth in his words, which flared within her like a long dormant spark. At home, she went straight to her chamber and closed the door. With trembling hands, she took out her father's manuscript, opened it to the margin, and pressed her pen there. Fire is not sin, but it burns all the same. That night she did not sleep. Outside, the wind stirred the eaves, and in the hearth, the flame whispered a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Chillingworth, seated below in the study, glanced up at her darkened window and narrowed his eyes. He had noticed the change. Her voice, her gaze, the brief smile that sometimes flitted across her lips like a moth to a candle. "She hides something," he muttered, and though he could not yet name it, he resolved that no secret belonging to Hester Prynne would remain hidden for long. The Sabbath was gray and hushed, as though the very air partook in the solemn rites performed beneath the steep-pitched roof of St. Petrock's. The townsfolk moved slowly into the chapel, the hems of their cloaks damp with thawing frost, and the bells pealed with a stern, iron clangor that echoed like judgment. Hester knelt, as was proper, beside her mother in the third pew. Roger Chillingworth stood alone near the altar rail, his face unreadable in the dim candlelight. His eyes, though lowered in prayer, flickered once toward her, and she felt them even with her own eyes closed. The sermon spoke of obedience, of the snares of the flesh, of Eve's curse passed down through daughters who thought themselves wiser than the garden's command. Each word seemed chosen with cruel precision, as if the minister, perhaps unwittingly, struck a flint against Hester's already frayed conscience. "Let not the heart deceive thee," intoned the Reverend, "for it is a cunning instrument, bent toward its own ruin. Better to bind the heart in chains of duty than loose it to the world's temptation." Beside her, Margaret whispered a sharp amen. But Hester's lips remained still. After the service, as the congregation filtered slowly into the chill air, Chillingworth approached her with the gravity of a man nearing the close of a scholarly treatise. "You did not sing the final hymn," he said quietly. "I had no voice for it," she replied. He studied her a moment. "Perhaps you are unwell. Or is it another matter?" Her pulse quickened. "If I am unwell, it is a condition not found in your books." His brow furrowed. "Your tongue grows sharp. Beware, Hester. The town sees much, and it remembers what it sees." She met his gaze with a calmness she did not feel. "Let them see me, then. I wear no mask." "No," he said slowly, "but you wear armor. And I wonder, what are you defending?" She turned away without answer. That night, beneath the bitter light of a waning moon, Hester returned to the woodshed, her sanctuary, her cell. She brought with her the muslin for her wedding shift, the unfinished embroidery, and her father's parchment. There, alone in the dark, she laid each object before her like relics before a priest. "I have borne this silence," she said aloud. "I have stitched it into cloth, swallowed it with my mother's food, bowed beneath it at the altar, and still it burns." She took up the crimson thread and, with desperate force, drove the needle through the muslin's white surface. The cloth tore slightly. "I do not seek sin," she whispered, "only truth. And yet even truth is counted as sin when spoken by a woman." She worked furiously now, the thread pulled taut, knotting at times, her hands red with cold. Each stitch was a prayer or a curse. She could no longer distinguish. A wind stirred outside. It pushed open the shed door just enough to cast a ghostly light across her face. She did not look up. "Should I marry him?" she said aloud, though no one answered. "Should I vow myself before man and God with lips that do not consent?" In the silence that followed, something cracked inside her. Not a wild defiance, but a kind of sorrow that bore the weight of many years to come. She rose and took the muslin, the parchment, and the thread, and laid them in the hearth. The fire was low but hungry. One by one, she fed it her rebellion, the garment, the words, the blood-colored thread. The flames caught and danced, devouring the tokens of her silence. As the last edge of cloth blackened and curled to ash, she whispered, "Let the world judge me by what I become, not what they have chosen for me." By the time she returned to the house, her hands smelled of smoke, and her eyes bore no tears. Margaret did not stir in her sleep. But in the morning, Roger Chillingworth noted the scent of ash on her gown and the absence of the wedding cloth from its place. He said nothing, but inwardly he marked the moment, and he began to watch her with a scholar's interest, one that was not altogether benign. The days that followed passed with the dull inevitability of a fate already pronounced. The townspeople remarked upon Hester's silence, though they had no words for its new texture, that it had turned from obedience to withdrawal, and from withdrawal to something colder still. "She dreams too deeply," muttered Goody Wallace to her neighbor. "That sort of girl. Too much reading and too little praying." Roger Chillingworth said nothing in public. But in his study, his quill stilled more often than before, as he watched her from the window, or paused upon the stair to listen outside her chamber door. The shift was gone. The fire, rekindled in the hearth that morning, bore the faint scent of scorched linen and silk thread. He drew his own conclusions. One afternoon, beneath the oppressive stillness of a rainless sky, Hester ventured again toward the woods, drawn not by escape, but by the instinct to breathe where judgment did not stalk her every footstep. She found Willem van Holt near the stream, sketching a pale orchid that clung to the stone with stubborn life. At the sound of her step, he turned and stood. "I thought you had vanished," he said. "I had," she replied. But not in the way you think. He studied her face. You are changed. Hester looked past him, toward the sky. I have burned what they gave me. The cloth, the vow, the name I was meant to carry. Then you are free. She shook her head slowly. No, for still they live here. She pressed her hand to her chest. As ghosts that do not sleep, and there is something now beneath my skin. A mark, though none can see it. Willem stepped closer, his voice gentle. A mark is not a curse unless you name it so. But they will name it, she said, the faintest tremor in her voice. And once spoken, it cannot be unsaid. There was silence between them, thick as clouded glass. A bird cried somewhere in the trees, its note sharp and final. He said, after a long pause, You do not belong here, Hester. No, she said, but neither do I belong elsewhere. I am as the stone in the riverbed, fixed, though the waters flow around me. He reached for her hand, then stopped, some final thread of restraint halting him. There are ships that do not return to their old ports. You might yet find one. And leave behind what is not finished? She asked. That is not my way. She looked down, her breath catching as she noticed her own hand. There, at the edge of her palm, a faint red flush. She rubbed at it, but it did not fade. It has begun, she murmured. What has? She did not answer. Her voice had receded inward, toward some cavern where names took shape. That evening, by the weak glow of her bedside candle, Hester examined her skin again. The flush at her palm had grown no brighter, but neither had it faded. It was as though her conscience had branded her from within. What am I becoming? She wondered. A thing set apart? Or a woman who walks in her own truth, though barefoot on burning ground? She took up the quill from her father's inkstand, now hers by right of inheritance and sorrow, and penned the final entry in the margins of the ruined manuscript. The letter comes not by the hand of man, but by the hand of God, or perhaps by that of conscience. Either way, I will wear it. Downstairs, Roger Chillingworth paced slowly before the embers. A thought had begun to take root, dark, unformed, but growing. She hides a truth, he whispered, more to himself than any present ear. And the truth, when it rises, will have teeth. The dawn came pale and unwilling, casting a colorless glow over the village of Lidford. It was a quiet morning, too quiet for comfort. The air hung heavy, as though the earth herself were holding breath. In her chamber, Hester sat by the window, unbraiding the last of her mother's plaits from her dark hair. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as though each strand loosed from its binding marked the lifting of some ancient chain. The scar upon her palm, if such it could be called, had faded somewhat. Yet the memory of it remained, etched more surely upon her soul than her flesh. She knew now what it had been. A summons, not a condemnation. Her mother entered then, bearing folded linens. You are not yet dressed, said Margaret Prynne, her brow creased with familiar disapproval. I shall not wear the green today, Hester said quietly. Margaret paused. It is the color Chillingworth chose. He spoke of it only yesterday, that it would match your eyes. Hester turned toward her. I will not wear the color of a man's choosing, nor stand silent at an altar I did not walk to freely. Margaret stared. Hester, speak not so. You are pledged. I was pledged in fear, and fear is no vow. A tremor passed through the older woman's hand. You would bring shame upon us both. Upon the memory of your father. His memory bids me speak, not be silent. Hester interrupted, her voice firm. He taught me to think, to question, to write truth in ink even when the truth wounded. There was a pause, in which Margaret Prynne's expression became unreadable. So, she said at last, you will cast off your duty? For what? A stranger with foreign words and dangerous thoughts. I cast off nothing, said Hester. I take up my soul, which I had laid down like a garment in winter, and whether I walk alone or in company, I will do so with my name unmasked. Margaret turned sharply. Then you are no longer my daughter. If that is your will, Hester said. Her voice did not break, though her heart wept within her. Later that morning, Hester made her way through the village green, head held high, her hair loose to the wind, her garments plain but unbound by tradition. A few turned to look, and whispers stirred behind her like dry leaves. At the edge of the green stood Willem van Holt, saddling his horse beside the battered hull of the De Vrede, now mended and near departure. "You are leaving," she said. He turned to her, surprised. "Tomorrow at dawn. I shall not come with you." His eyes searched hers. "Then why are you here?" "To tell you I have chosen. Not escape, not silence, not shame. I will stay and face what comes. But I will face it standing." He studied her face, so young and yet shadowed by a strength born of fire. "I never meant to tempt you," he said, "only to show you that you were more than what they named you." "You showed me," she said, "and for that I am changed. But the path I walk must be mine." He nodded, his expression solemn. "Then may the wind be ever at your back, Hester Prynne. And may you speak truth where others fear to listen," she replied. They did not embrace. They did not touch. But in their parting was a tenderness far more lasting than passion. By the time she returned home, Margaret was gone to chapel, and Roger Chillingworth sat alone in the study, quill in hand. Hester stepped into the room and placed before him a folded parchment. "What is this?" he asked. "My answer," she said. "Read it or burn it. I no longer dwell in silence." He looked at her long and hard, his cold scholar's gaze flickering, for the first time, into something like disbelief. "You think to defy the course set before you?" he asked. "I do not defy the course," she said. "I correct it." She turned and left him with the page in hand. And in the solitude that followed, Roger Chillingworth unfolded the parchment and read her clear, elegant script. "I am not thy vessel. I am not thy reward. I am not thy scholar's prize. I am Hester Prynne, and I belong only to truth." The weeks that followed passed like the slow unfurling of a winter blossom, uncertain, yet inevitable. Word spread through Lidford as all news does in small towns, on the breath of suspicion and the whisper of scandal. "She cast him off," said some. "She made oath to no man," said others. "She speaks as though she were a minister," murmured the oldest among them, with brows knit in theological alarm. But none could deny what followed. It began with small things. Hester mended Goody Harrow's torn bodice without charge. She returned old books to the chapel, annotated in the margins with gentle corrections to the minister's Latin. She helped deliver a child when the midwife fell ill, staying through the night and praying softly over the blood and cries. Women, especially, began to seek her out, not publicly but in private moments. Young wives with bruises hidden beneath sleeves. Widows afraid of the constable's knock. Maids burdened with shame no man would own. And always Hester listened. She asked no questions whose answers would wound, nor gave judgment where none was needed. She became, in secret, a kind of confessor. "She walks with the bearing of one who knows," said Goody Wallace, whose gossip had once been sharp. "Not proud, but steady." One chill evening, as Hester gathered firewood near the chapel grounds, she encountered Reverend Paris, the new curate, whose zeal far exceeded his kindness. "You ought not be seen near the sanctuary," he said. "There are murmurs." "Murmurs are no concern of mine," said Hester, straightening. "You think yourself above reproof?" he asked. "I think only to be true." The Reverend frowned. "And what truth compels a woman to break vows made before God?" "I made no vow," she said quietly. "Only a promise to silence, which I have now broken. God hears truth as well as oaths." He drew his cloak tighter, discomfited. "You tread a narrow path, Mistress Prynne." "I do," she said, "but better the narrow path walked in light than the broad one laid by others' design." He left her then without reply. Later that night, Hester stood by her small hearth, Pearl's unfinished shift still tucked away in the chest where she had first hidden her shame. She opened it now, not to finish it, but to cut it into scraps. Each piece she stitched anew, into bandages and swaddles for the poor. From the ruins of that wedding garment, She made cloth that warmed the sick and soothed the dying. Thus did she transmute the symbol of her rebellion into an emblem of her grace. Margaret Prynne said little now, save for the occasional sigh when Hester passed through the house without veil or bow. Roger Chillingworth, for his part, had departed Lidford. Word came that he had returned to London to continue his studies in the dark arts of medicine, though none said it with cheer. One morning, Hester found a note slipped beneath her door, unsigned but unmistakable in its Dutch hand. You have chosen the harder path. That is the path most worth walking. Should the wind ever turn, seek me. W. She smiled faintly, folded the note, and placed it not near her heart, but within the folds of her father's manuscript. I do not need rescue, she thought. I need only resolve. Outside, the sun broke through the gray for the first time in weeks, casting long shadows on the frost-kissed earth. She stepped into the light, no scarlet letter upon her breast, yet bearing within her the knowledge of one, marked not by shame, but by strength. The letter no longer burned. It glowed. The seasons turned. Spring came at last, not with a trumpet, but with a whisper, buds blooming modestly on the blackthorn, and lambs stumbling into life on the common fields. Lidford, in its way, forgot what it had not understood. Yet there were some who remembered and remembered differently. Hester Prynne walked among them with calm purpose, no longer a specter of scandal, but a presence quietly acknowledged. She did not speak of her choice. She bore no badge nor mantle to declare her path. And yet, in the silence that surrounded her name, a new meaning emerged. Once, Goody Wallace, passing Hester in the market, tipped her head and said simply, "Well met, Mistress Prynne," and Hester, with no bitterness and no triumph, replied, "God keep thee, Goody." Even Margaret Prynne softened, if only in tone. One evening as Hester prepared a tincture for an ill child, Margaret lingered in the doorway and said, "Thy father would not have recognized thee." "I hope he would have," said Hester without pride. "But perhaps he would have seen a daughter, not the girl he left." "Perhaps," murmured Margaret, "perhaps." In the margins of the old manuscript, Hester continued to write, not with the feverish ink of rebellion, but with the slow and steady hand of reflection. Her entries grew into essays, meditations on virtue, conscience, and the solitude of truth. "There is no salvation in silence," she penned, "nor in submission. A woman may bend, but she must never be broken. She may obey where obedience is just, but never where it is false. For her soul is not a field to be sown by another's hand, but a garden she must tend herself." These writings she hid away, not out of shame, but with the patience of one who knows her season has not yet come. One twilight, a girl of barely 15 came to Hester's door, trembling, with tear-stained cheeks and a letter clutched in her hand. A letter she dared not show her father. Hester took her in, spoke no word of judgment, and gave her tea sweetened with honey and silence. At last the girl asked, "Is it true what they say, that you said no to the man your mother chose for you?" "It is," Hester said. "And that you stayed?" "I did." "Why?" Hester paused. Then, looking the girl in the eyes, she said, "Because a woman must learn to speak her own name, even if she must do so alone." The girl, after a moment, nodded. She left with her burden lightened, though nothing had changed, save, perhaps, herself. Years later, the townsfolk would recall the woman who lived in the house with the lavender vines, who stitched fine garments and said little, yet listened always. They would not remember her scandal, only her steadiness. And in some dim corner of the chapel library, her writings would be found, unsigned but unmistakable in voice. She was ahead of her time, a minister's daughter would say, thumbing the yellowed pages. No one knew quite when Hester had begun to be revered rather than pitied. It happened as such things do, invisibly, then all at once. On the day she died, many gathered, not out of obligation, but reverence. The bell tolled not with dirge but solemn grace. And on her headstone, simple and without ornament, was carved the single line, "Here lies Hester Prynne, who bore no letter but lived its truth." Hester Prynne's journey began not with shame, but with strength, and the quiet choices that shaped her courage. If the story moved you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Like this video, subscribe for more powerful literary tales, and share it with fellow story lovers who cherish the voices behind the classics.